One of the funnier things about early video game history is how often sequels to smash hit video games would go in radically different directions before they had ever established norms and consistency in their design philosophies. Super Mario Bros. Was a simple, if challenging game that gently scaled in difficulty as the game went on, while Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels starts as if a direct continuation of its predecessor, with some of the harshest, most unfair, and difficult platforming the NES has ever seen. Zelda 2 went from a top-down adventure game with puzzle solving and exploration as its focus to a game where 80% of its interactions took place as a side-scrolling platformer with action combat at the forefront. Castlevania went from a tightly designed level-based platformer to an open-world, non-linear game that was a little before its time in terms of the genre's popularity, while also failing to live up to its predecessor in terms of design. Even sequels that didn't shift genre still couldn't escape this fate, with Metal Gear's NES port being so successful internationally that Konami elected to create their own sequel without the series' creator Hideo Kojima specifically for Western audiences that was far more bombastic and over-the-top in its action, akin to the blockbuster films of the era. Final Fantasy remained an RPG, but it went in an entirely new direction with its growth systems, party composition, and character abilities that fans to this day argue whether or not it stands as tall as its more classically designed odd-numbered siblings. Leave it to Dragon Quest then to remain true to its roots and not only stick to its genre, but iterate and expand off this original game in a way that amplified what was already there, giving players more freedom in combat and exploration. But why is this game not as celebrated as the others in its series? To put it bluntly, hubris, and how quickly the greatest laid plans can fall apart. Join me today as we take a look at one of the most infamous RPGs ever made, Dragon Quest II for the NES. Dragon Quest was an unabashed success. Its May 1986 release was so strong that a month before said release, in April of 1986, the team at Chunsoft started developing a sequel. The first thing the team at Chunsoft had to do was decide how exactly they would iterate on the first title, and one of the first things they elected to do was expand the combat. The first game's combat, while novel and simple as intended, can also be described charitably as bland and not so charitably as monotonous. Because every fight was one-on-one, fights quickly devolved into happy slaps where it was more efficient to mash the attack button and eat hits, since every turn you healed was another turn you took damage, and if you got put to sleep or took a crit after healing, that meant you not only wasted a turn, but were now at a disadvantage. Yuji Horii, the lead designer of the first game and mind behind the series, had intended to include a party of characters in the first game, but was limited by the space on the Famicom's cartridges. With the success of Dragon Quest, Enix felt comfortable allocating the team more storage space, almost double the space the original game had. 125 kilobytes, or 1 megabit to be more specific. The added space meant the team could implement a party, but it became clear that there was an upper limit on just how many characters could be displayed on screen at once before visual issues started to take hold. The team ended up deciding to have a party of 3 characters, enough to expand the gameplay possibilities in combat on the player's end, while avoiding sprite flickering when in the overworld, since both additional party members would be displayed at all times. Of course, it wouldn't be fair to the monsters if we fought them 3-on-1 the entire game, so they also got to step up their game. Now, up to 8 monsters can appear on screen at once, and every single one of them would be displayed simultaneously. The sheer amount of added combatants to the battle system could prove enough to justify a sequel alone, but Hori, returning director Koichi Nakamura, and the team at Chunsoft weren't about to rest on their laurels when it came to improving on their golden child. While fleshing out the combat was a central goal of the team, expanding the world design was another. Alefgard in the original game was a single continent, and could be fully navigated in less than 5 minutes at high enough levels. Dragon Quest II took the world design from the first game and did the same thing they did with the combat design, going bigger and larger in every aspect. Multiple castles, multiple continents, more than one mandatory dungeon before the final boss. This was going to be a true, bona fide world. So much so that the map was over double the size of the original game. The world's expansion also lent into the story being significantly fleshed out, with actual linear progression and narrative beats, unlike the first game, where the story can be described as, "Bad guy threatens the world, go save the day, mighty hero." Akira Toriyama and Koichi Sugiyama both returned in their previous roles as well, with the former putting in work to greatly increase the number of enemies and their designs. The first game had 40 enemies to fight, but only 13 unique enemy designs, not counting the Dragon Lord and his 2 forms, which bumped the number to 15. The first game certainly had its fair share of iconic Dragon Quest style designs, but I think this is the title that really solidified Dragon Quest's monster design philosophy in stone. These were not just monsters to beat up like generic mobs, but characters in their own right. The orcs and cyclops in this game are some of my favorites in Toriyama's library, with the robot enemies, liquid slimes, called babbles in the localization, puppets, saber-toothed cats, and more being delightful highlights to add to Dragon Quest's iconic art style and enemy design. Toriyama put so much work in that the game had a grand total of 82 monsters in it, and more impressively, over 30 unique monsters to fight, not including the final bosses. Dragon Quest II sounds like a triumphant sequel that followed up perfectly with the original, doing everything Hori wanted to include in the original, like a party of adventurers, expanded combat, a greater item pool, and a world that was well over double the size of the original. Sales-wise, it absolutely was, at least in Japan. Released only 8 months after the original on January 26, 1987, it sold through its first 500,000 units in its first day of release, and by the end of the year had sold nearly 2.5 million copies. Japanese fans absolutely loved the game, regarding it as a blanket improvement over the original title, and rating it highly even today. This is a stark comparison to the reaction the game received in the North American market. After the failure to launch with Nintendo's 1989 publishing of Dragon Warrior, Nintendo decided it was time to move on from the series in North America. Not even managing to cross 1 million copies on an install base as large as the NES could absolutely be considered an indictment of quality and popularity, but as discussed in the previous video, I don't blame Dragon Warrior the game for its failure, more so the environment it was released into because of poor decision making from Nintendo and Enix themselves. But without Nintendo, Enix was left without a way to publish their titles in foreign markets, so it was up to them to bring their games over to the West. Founding Enix America Corporation, the goal of this branch was to expand their reach into North America and hopefully manage to find a foothold Nintendo wasn't able to. Despite a quick turnaround time and releasing for the holiday season of 1990, Dragon Warrior 2 was barely able to sell a fifth of the number the original game pushed, with 150,000 units sold, and that 500,000 number the original game reached was with numbers inflated by Nintendo Power subscriptions. Reviews for the game were heavily mixed, with some appreciating what had improved from the original title, but some wondering just how the series has become so popular in Japan when it appeared to be so antiquated in its design philosophies. One review even compared it negatively to Ultima, which is hilarious considering the series was inspired by Ultima and has since surpassed it in popularity. With two very different reactions, it seems that this was simply a case of a late localization, once again dooming Dragon Quest to its niche fate in the West. But surprisingly, if you were to ask Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura their thoughts on Dragon Quest II, they came out of it far less satisfied than they did with the first game. Koichi Nakamura is quoted from a 1989 interview saying, quote, "Dragon Quest II ended up receiving favorable reviews from everyone, but from our perspective as the creators, we felt like we were only able to accomplish about half of what we had wanted to do." What in the world caused such a strange divide between audience and creatives in Japan? Why is Dragon Quest II considered such a contentious game in the Western community compared to its far less complex predecessor? Today, I am going to be looking at the 1990 Enix-localized Dragon Warrior 2 to try and pinpoint exactly where the pain points of this title exist, if there are any. This title screen is much more interesting than the original game, that's for sure. Full sprites of the main cast walking towards us out of a dark cave, and the always classic Dragon Quest Overture playing to greet them. Dragon Warrior 2 actually did benefit from the later localization once again, most significantly as soon as you create a save file. An opening crawl establishes that this is a direct, if distant sequel to the original title, and that after saving Alefgard, the hero and his love left for greater shores beyond. Their descendants would rule those lands, including the Kingdom of Moonbrooke. Said kingdom is the first thing we see, the king of the realm and his daughter, the princess, spending time together in the castle courtyard. But as soon as we're shown this peaceful scene, it's interrupted by a castle guard rushing in to inform the king that the wizard Hargon is invading the castle. The king calls his troops into battle as quickly as he can, but knows the monsters will be too much for them. He instructs his daughter to hide, knowing this might be his end, but wanting more than anything for her safety. When a monster appears behind them and threatens her, the king manages to distract the fiend and kill it, but is quickly swarmed from all sides and killed by the rampaging beasts. As the princess watches her father die and the monsters lay waste to the castle, one brave soldier manages to limp away with his life, hoping to warn the neighboring kingdoms of Hargon's wrath. He manages to reach Midenhall, and with his final breaths, is able to alert the king and his son, the prince, to the immediate danger. The king knows he is far too old to take on the wizard at this point, so he gives his son money and a sword in order to begin his journey to defeat this new evil. This opening is really cool. Hell, I would almost say cinematic in a way, especially considering the hardware. I could totally see the guard crawling away from the castle with a swelling score as it burns, and then a hard cut to the title card. This intro is entirely exclusive to the NES version, and was so effective it was implemented in all future releases of the game in Japan and internationally. The original release started with the guard in Midenhall relaying his woes, so while the stakes were set, not getting to see them directly definitely lessens the weight that they carry. Other instructions the king gave us was to find worthy companions to journey with us, our cousins in Connacht and Moonbrooke. Of course, Moonbrooke Castle has been razed to the ground, so it might be a tad difficult to reach without help, so heading to Connacht might be the safest play for us. Leaving Midenhall and encountering our first monsters, there's already a couple of differences from the first game that are instantly noticeable. Some are small, like the fact that the battle screens no longer include backgrounds in order to display multiple detailed enemy sprites on screen. While this could be considered a negative, it's just a fact that the NES wasn't powerful enough to handle graphics like that, and personally, it doesn't bug me that much. I understand if it could be considered immersion breaking for some, but I wouldn't consider this a point against this game at all. The text speed is also much faster, especially in battle. Arguably too fast, as a couple of times I would be too caught up in one action and lose track of another and have to check the status of my party to ensure things were still stable. It's a welcome improvement though, especially considering how much more can happen in one fight compared to last time. Stairs are now context sensitive, thank God, and search has been combined with take to make chest opening a little quicker than before. Doors have been changed a tad, with keys now being used as unlimited key items, which is both a welcome change and something I'll come back to a bit later. A larger change is that equipment now isn't automatic, nor is its progression entirely linear. In Dragon Quest I, there was a very simple progression of equipment and items that made things extremely simple to understand for newcomers to the genre, but makes things arguably too simple for veteran players. There was little choice in how to build your character, simply going from town to town, and the further along you progressed, the better the equipment would become. Sure, things like Erdrick's sword were optional, but it was far and away the best sword in the game, so it made little sense not to grab it in order to speed up your progression. Dragon Quest II not only has some weapons and armor that aren't linearly better, but have alternative effects when using them. The biggest example being the Falcon Sword, which has a weaker attack power, but lets the user attack twice per turn, giving you a chance to land a critical hit twice per turn. Decisions like these led to the equip option being added to the menu, as now players will have to make decisions on which party members get kitted out with specific weapons and armor. While the game's graphical presentation in the overworld isn't much different compared to the original Dragon Warrior release, it was a massive step up comparing Dragon Quest to Dragon Quest II. Character sprites in Dragon Warrior were modeled after the character sprites in Dragon Quest II's Japanese release, so while for Western players the jump in graphics was less noticeable, for a Japanese audience it must have been an incredible leap to go from a crab-walking, faceless protagonist to a full party turning and twisting around the world in only 8 months. Another part of the presentation I'd like to compliment is that the music in this game is leaps and bounds better than the first. I was kind to Sugiyama in the last video because it was an early composition for the NES, as well as his first RPG, and while I don't dislike DQ's soundtrack, this game runs circles around it. The overworld themes are much better at inspiring adventure and feeling more grand in their scope. The cave theme is used 8 times with increasingly deeper tones depending on the floor you're at, and now dungeons have different songs associated with them depending on their environment. The battle theme is less of a single continuous sound broken up by very staccato notes before it loops, and now has more of a bounce and rhythm to it. While it isn't overly long, it's a much better song at getting across the danger every encounter holds. And yes, I said every encounter, because this is how the first fight in the game went. Yeah, this game greets you much more rudely than the original Dragon Quest. While that title had a somewhat safe starting zone where the enemies were weak and squishy in order to allow you to build yourself up, this game doesn't do that. While there are single enemy encounters, you can also run into groups of 2 or 3, some that can even poison you. The game throws a lot more at you at the start, some of it self-explanatory like the new parry command that lets you block incoming attacks for half damage in exchange for not attacking, as well as the poison status that can only be cured via item or visiting a church. Oh, sorry, House of Healing in the West. The Prince of Middenhall starts off exactly like his ancestor of old did, with nothing but the ability to swing his sword at enemies until they die. But eventually we do hit level 3 and... where's my heal spell? Actually, I didn't get any MP either, which is weird because it's on the battle menu. Oh boy, I might need to hurry up and find my cousin quickly. Heading west, we find the town of Leftwine, which sits about equidistant between Middenhall and Cannock, and acts as our first checkpoint on the way to find our cousin. While there isn't much here, it's a good resting point while we build strength, because god damn are the monsters around here not taking prisoners. Once we feel capable, we make our way north to Cannock and talk to the king, who tells us that his son actually left to look for us, visiting the Wellspring of Heroes to the east to receive a blessing for the start of his journey. We follow him, but find once again we just missed him and that he's now headed to Middenhall Castle. Making the long trek back, our father tells us that we somehow missed each other again and that he's left the castle in an attempt to find us. With only one place left to check, we go to Leftwine, and sure enough, the prince is resting in the inn when we get there and we finally link up. I adore this theme, and I'm glad it becomes a mainstay in the series. The prince starts at level 1, which is insane because we were level 4 and struggling not to die to the hordes of monsters around here, but after building his strength up a bit, we finally unlock our first magic spells. Heal, which Canuck knows at level 1, thank god, and Fireball, which sounds great, but considering how strong the monsters are and how we can't afford to waste money, Canuck is relegated to a cleanup and support role until further notice. To avoid any confusion, I'm going to be calling the main characters by their kingdom's names, since it's the most consistent part of their character no matter which version you play. In most versions, players can only name the Prince of Middenhall, and the other two party members have random names chosen from the pool. This is why the Prince of Middenhall has the rather stock name of Connor, because my original plan was to reference one of my favorite trios of superheroes from when I was a kid. Bonus points if you guys can figure out the reference. The random names for the cousins is fine, but it does make talking about them a bit harder, so I'm going to call them Middenhall, Canuck, and Moonbrook when the situation calls for it, simply to be concise and avoid unnecessary confusion. With our cousin in tow, the pair heads south towards Moonbrook through an underground tunnel which connects to another continent. After a long trek, the two reach the town of Hamlin, where its citizens tell us to keep a sharp eye out, for things in this town are not as they seem on the surface. At the moment, it's unclear what he means, but talking around we do manage to find a dog that joins up with us, which might be one of the first times in video games an animal joins the party. Can't wait to see what they can... Oh, it leaves when we leave town. Boo! This is the closest town to Moonbrook Castle, and while it takes us a second to reach there because the monsters in the surrounding area are so strong, once we do reach it, we find the spirits of the recently departed are lingering around. Some still panicking as if they were in their final moments, and others giving us information on the Mirror of Ra, a relic hidden in a swamp where four bridges meet. The King of Moonbrook even tells us of his daughter's fate, transformed into a common mutt and left to fend for herself. With all of that information, we make our way to the swamp and find the mirror, then show it to the Velcro dog in Hamlin, whose reflection isn't that of a mutt, but of a young girl. The mirror shatters in a blinding light, and when it fades, the Princess of Moonbrook is standing before us, restored. Without a moment's hesitation, she requests to join us on our journey, and considering we were looking for her aid anyway, this benefits all parties involved. Dragon Quest II featuring a female party member in only its second game is a welcome surprise, especially after the last game's safer depiction of a damsel in distress. While Moonbrook did need saving, she takes no time at all to get back into the fray once saved, and comes with stronger spells off the bat than her cousin, making her our dedicated spellcaster for the adventure. Of course, she also starts at level 1, so we have to grind just a bit more to get her built up, but thankfully this is made far easier due to another change Dragon Quest II makes from the first game, and that's multiple save points. The first game only featured one place to save, and that was in Tantagel Castle, which made sense considering how small the world of Dragon Quest was, but now with Dragon Quest II's much larger world combined with harsher enemy encounters, it would be exhausting having to trek all the way back to Middenhall every single time you wanted to save. This game not only allows you to save with any king in any castle, which means Canuck is also an option, but some towns now also feature save points. It's a welcome change, and the reason I bring it up now is that Hamlin features one of these new save points, meaning death, like the first game, only results in losing half of your money and dusting yourself off with no loss of experience or story progression. Exploring around, there are only 2 locations we can go at the moment, but we're heavily pushed to go east to the Tower of the Wind. This place houses a treasure we need to progress further, the Cloak of Wind. It doesn't have combat capability, but it does do something pretty sweet. Glide. By leaping off of a high platform, the party can act as Linkwood 30 years later and hang in the air for a grand total of 1 map tile.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
That wasn't flying. That was falling with style.
Yeah, this isn't the most exciting or useful item, but it is our key forward. Heading back to Hamlin and Moonbrook Castle to the west, Going even further leads us to a shrine that allows us passage to another landmass. Said landmass is fairly empty for us at the moment, with an impossible mountain range to the south blocking us and the rest of the land being a spacious and empty desert. But at the northern tip of the landmass lies a river we currently can't cross. Unless... the two towers... wait, nope. Pair of towers, there we go. This pair of towers, known as the Dragon's Horns, aren't a maze like the Tower of Wind. It's simply a matter of making it to the top and equipping the Cloak of Wind to one of our party and leaping off of the north end of the tower. With the wind's guidance, we float gently across the river and find ourselves on another new landmass. The first landmark that's immediately visible is a town, which is a welcome sight after the long trek here. This is Lianport, a coastal town with a dock out to the wider waters of the world. It's a shame we don't have a boat to use. Before we can dwell on that though, exploring the town reveals that there are monsters attacking a young girl. She calls for help and we manage to fend off the imps, and as thanks, she takes us to her grandfather, who just as quickly gives us a first for the Dragon Quest series and arguably an iconic part of RPG design, a boat to sail the open ocean. This is where Dragon Quest II takes a drastic departure from the first game in terms of its design, and I want to use this time to really talk about this game's opening. By the time you get the boat, it will have taken you several hours of gameplay, most of it linear progression from one point to the next. It's much more structured than Dragon Quest I, and features minor but set plot beats like finding your cousins, discovering the fate of Moonbrook, and journeying to Lianport and acquiring the boat. These are things you cannot avoid, though, like the first game, you can do them in a somewhat unique order should you choose to do so. However, the two major gates are finding your cousins, as you can't leave the first landmass without the Prince of Connacht, and you can't leave the second without the Princess of Moonbrook. It's a very cool segment in theory, and one I do enjoy narratively. It establishes the stakes, world, and characters in an organic way, has multiple dungeons with valuable rewards such as the Silver Key and Cloak of Wind, and allows us to come to grips with the combat system in a relatively safe environment where death doesn't set us back hours and hours. However, this is also where the first major flaw of Dragon Quest II starts to rear its head, and that is its difficulty as well as its absurd encounter rate. Dragon Quest II was an extremely ambitious sequel. Too ambitious, one could say. That becomes readily apparent as soon as the game begins and the groups of enemies on the field start dogpiling Middenhall with reckless abandon. The fight design in this game was meant to make players engage with every encounter as if it was a serious threat, unlike the first game, where you could mindlessly grind against enemies for hours with little danger. And that's an admirable goal. I want to say right now, before I go into the weeds here, that Dragon Quest II is not a fundamentally flawed title. It is one that reeks of overambition and far too little time to control that fire, but it is not an irredeemable tire fire. The reality of Dragon Quest II on the NES is that it is an unforgiving, unrelenting, and at its worst, monotonous mess of design with combat that is far too punishing, that occurs far too often to be fun. From the start of the game, enemies hit too hard to make multiple fights in a row possible without healing. Since Middenhall can't use magic, that means abusing inns and herbs, which means spending money you need for better equipment. Fortunately, it doesn't take too long to get the Prince of Connacht, just under an hour for me, so this first segment of the game wasn't awful, but it didn't set a good precedent either. It's once you cross to the second continent and begin looking for the Princess of Moonbrook that things start to unravel. Enemies start to appear in larger numbers and throw more powerful attacks at you. This is standard difficulty progression, except with every encounter being designed with the idea that they would be more engaging. It means you will often be lucky to end fights without needing to heal one or both party members. This is fine enough at the start of the continent, after all, it is a new area and it's meant to be a difficulty bump, but even after rescuing the princess and grinding the team up to levels I thought would be sufficient, I couldn't go anywhere without taking loads of damage and courting death. And that's where Dragon Quest II's difficulty is realized. The absurdly low power of its main party, and how they never truly feel like they're growing in strength. The idea behind each member of the party is that they cover each other's weaknesses and can shine in individual areas. Middenhall is the physical monster, with the highest HP and attack of the party, capable of dealing absurd damage and taking it right back. But his lack of magic in any capacity makes him a liability when fighting groups of enemies, as he is forced to attack one at a time, just like the protagonist of the first game, without the benefit of a single file line attacking him. Canuck is the jack of all trades of the party, weaker both offensively and defensively than Middenhall, but still able to wield martial stats to some effect, while also wielding low power magic that can clean up in a pinch. Moonbrook is the dedicated mage of the group, with a physical attack that might as well not exist, but magic spells powerful enough to be used all the way up until the end of the game. Her magic pool is also deeper than Canuck's, meaning she'll be pouring on the magic throughout the fight, while Canuck will need to pivot with physical attacks and item use more than his cousins. This is all well and good, but allow me to be a little more explicit here. The scaling of the party's strength is absolute horseshit. From how Canuck gets effectively sidelined within an hour of his first appearance, the lack of useful equipment for 2 of the 3 characters, and how shambolic the random encounter design is, Dragon Quest II has some of the most poorly thought out progression I've seen in an RPG. I got so many game overs in this game compared to the first, and while I have beaten both of these games before, so I had a vague idea of how to progress, that was on newer versions with faster progression and better quality of life overall. This was my first time playing the NES originals, and while Dragon Quest I was simple in its design and execution, Dragon Quest II, even with a general understanding of the RPG genre and the game itself, feels agonizing to play in its worst moments. To give you an idea of how frustrating this game is to play, let me illustrate using examples of this very playthrough to illuminate why playing Dragon Quest II can feel like pulling teeth. When you get new party members in this game, they start at level 1, with very basic equipment on their person. For Canuck, this isn't too much of an issue, since you can buy better equipment for him immediately to catch him up to speed. But for Moonbrook, of the 16 weapons and 19 pieces of armor available in the game, she can equip 4 weapons and 5 pieces of armor. She can't even use shields, meaning her defenses are atrocious for 2 story-required dungeons, and considering this game has no aggro system, that means enemies can dump all their attacks into one slot with no rhyme or reason. When I got Moonbrook and tried to level her up just to level 2, she died twice, and it took me over 10 minutes of real-world time. For context, fights outside of Hamlin can award 40 experience, meaning it shouldn't take more than 3 fights to get 1 level with her, but because I have no control over Moonbrook's defenses or how the enemy attacks, I had to pray that I get lucky and she can survive the fights to get those levels. Then, when she hits level 4, her power spikes to an absurd degree thanks to learning the Inferno spell. This hits a group of enemies with magic, making Moonbrook far better offensively and capable of clearing mobs extremely effectively for the rest of the game. However, it's at this moment that Canuck starts to fall behind. Once Moonbrook learns Infernos, the only thing he offers that's unique to him is lower cost healing and the antidote spell if a party member gets poisoned. That's well and good, but offensively, the dude becomes an absolute liability. His magic pool isn't large, so he can't fling spells with reckless abandon, and unlike Mindenhall, his available equipment list is paltry. The best weapon for him in the game is the Iron Spear, a weapon that gives him 20 attack. The best weapon that Mindenhall can get gives him 65. This means that Canuck, already a fairly weak party member since he's a jack of all trades and master of none, slowly peters out into a punching bag whose only purpose in battles is to eat hits, stay standing, and keep the two offensive party members alive and healthy so they can end fights quicker. And this is made even worse by the insane encounter rate. I'm sure everyone who's played an RPG with random encounters has had those moments where you can end a fight and then immediately run into another one. It's a minor annoyance, but it can be a humorous moment when it occurs the few times it does. In Dragon Quest II, not only does this happen often enough to cause headaches, but upwards of 4 to 5 steps in a row can proc encounters, and considering how difficult they can be, this makes traversing the world safely a massive issue. I cannot stress enough how important it is to learn which enemies you're capable of beating and which ones are worth running away from to preserve your sanity, because sometimes you'll load into an encounter after getting halfway through a long dungeon with no healing available, and know if you can't back away, you will die and have to run through it all again. While game overs in Dragon Quest were annoying, it never took too long to get back to where you needed to go, thanks to the scale of the adventure. But in this game, the world and dungeons are so much bigger and more complex that dying to random bullshit can make me squeeze my controller in frustration, knowing it's going to take significantly longer to get back, both in distance and possibly facing more obnoxious enemy encounters on the way. Hell, it doesn't need to be a full party wipe. Just losing one party member can absolutely destroy any progression and force you to walk back to the nearest town, or die to save on the walk back at the cost of your money. There are only 2 ways to revive a dead party member in this title. Canuck learns the revive spell at level 25? When I got to the final overworld area of the game, Canuck was level 17. So that's out the window. The other option is a Leaf of the World Tree, an entirely optional item that revives a party member to full health upon use. It's awesome, but its limitation is that you can only ever carry one at a time, so if you lose 2 of your 3 party members, tough shit. I'll talk about it more as the game goes on, but I wanted to make it perfectly clear before we sailed the seas that while I greatly appreciated the narrative expansion the beginning of the game offered compared to the original, the beautiful soundtrack, more varied monster designs, and the attempt at in-depth fighting mechanics, the lack of party strength and frustrating combat made any positive feelings I had towards the game muted because I was too busy battling against the game itself rather than growing and adapting. There isn't anything you can really do to alleviate the fight design besides running away constantly, but since that isn't a guarantee, you can still lose party members to random crits or the game not allowing you to run despite being theoretically fast for the area you're in. It's a betrayal of the basic tenets of RPG progression and crosses the fine line of tough, strategic fights into luck-based annoyances. Back to the story though, by sailing to the immediate east of Lianport, we can find a new landmass, one that plays a familiar piece of music. That's right! It's Alefgard from the first game. Still laid out in the exact same geography, but none of the towns from that game exist anymore, so the land is fairly empty. Tantagel Castle still stands though, so heading there we can stock up and better prepare for the adventure ahead. The king has mysteriously vanished, but the man who refills our MP for free is still here, so we can fully heal here for no charge, which is awesome. This truncated version of Alefgard does a wonderful job showing the player just how much larger the adventure of Dragon Quest II really is. Earlier I said that the map of this game was over double the size of the original, but I was actually underselling it. Dragon Quest I's map was 100 by 100 tiles, or 10,000 tiles. This game's map was 256 by 256 tiles, which is 65,536 tiles, well over 6 times the size of the original map. A lot of that size is the massive ocean we have to traverse, but even still, traveling up and down the continents that make up this world to get from point A to point B takes much longer than it did in the first game, and makes each excursion truly feel like its own adventure. At least, the first time you do it. Dragon Quest II's world design is interesting enough that even if you go somewhere and can't quite reach its endpoint, you certainly won't forget it and will make it a point to return later after digging around some more. As soon as we get the ship, the goal of the game becomes a massive scavenger hunt to reach Hargon and his castle by acquiring the 5 crests scattered throughout the land. Some of these are obtainable after you get the ship, with minimal resistance, but others require careful combing of the land to find other items in seemingly unrelated locations, such as the gold, jailer, and Watergate keys. I already mentioned the silver key earlier, and yes, like the first game, the keys are needed to unlock doors, but unlike the first game where they were consumable items, in this title, once you have the required key, as long as it stays in your inventory, you can unlock the requisite doors for the rest of the game. The silver key is the only one that doesn't hard restrict your story progress, so while not communicated to the player as blatantly, it is another set of items we'll need to find now that we have the ability to sail. The boat in this game shatters the previously established exploration of the first game and the beginning of this one. You can go nearly anywhere and do nearly anything at this point, but that nearly is a pretty major asterisk. One of the hurdles when designing an open world is making the exploration engaging enough without restricting the player. Some games, like Breath of the Wild, have no theoretical restrictions, with the only thing stopping you once you leave the Great Plateau being your own skill and understanding of the game, meaning exploration is for increasing your understanding and power, but rarely for lifting restrictions. Other games, like old-school Final Fantasy, will have big worlds you can explore, but take things in a more restrictive direction, like requiring certain story beats, items, characters, etc. before you can progress. Dragon Quest II does allow you to go almost anywhere on the map, but how effective that exploration is entirely dependent on what items you have at the given moment. If you don't have the golden key, for example, you can't enter Welgarth. Without the Jailer's key, you can't acquire the Watergate key, which in turn allows you to complete multiple required dungeons for items needed to progress and complete the story. Some of these items are easy to stumble into. The Moon Crest, for example, is just a matter of sailing to the Kingdom of Osterfair and talking to the king, who will give it to you after you display your power in combat for him. The gold key isn't locked away anywhere, just hidden on a certain tile in the remote fishing village of Zahan, indicated by a dog annoying the townspeople who only wanted to help. What a good boy. The Jailer's Key is also somewhat cool, a hidden item in the shop of Welgarth that at first glance seems to be a shop with a lower stock than others, but if you try to select the empty slot, the shopkeep asks you to keep it on the down low and sells you the key. But for every easy or simple task, there's another that's obtuse or flat out not explained properly. The game tries to give you the necessary tools to figure everything out, from NPC dialogue to key items. And at the very start of the game, I think it managed to do a solid job of offering a guiding hand, but not being heavy-handed with it. However, once you obtain the ship, the game struggles to remain clear in its direction. A good example of this is Tantagel, which has no required items to complete the game in it. It's a great inclusion, and if you played the first game, I feel most of us would feel obligated to explore the land and would find the shrine with Erdrick's helmet, Charlotte Castle with Erdrick's sword exactly where it was the last time, and the grandson of the Dragon Lord, who tells us that once we find all 5 crests, to find Rubis, who dwells south of Middenhall. None of these are required, but 2 of the 3 items here aren't locked behind a gate of any sort, and only require you being able to make it to them, which is easier said than done thanks to the combat, but they're visible on the world map, and beckon to you at the very least to check them out. Meanwhile, actual required items like the Sun Sigil sit out on the world map, ready to grab with no resistance, but there's very little direction towards it, and what there is isn't clear. You can find the echoing flute that's supposed to alert you to the crest's presence when you play it on the same screen as one, but unless you find the NPC in Osterfair who gives vague instructions on the flute, you'll have no idea what it does and where you're supposed to play it. Even then, his tips aren't the most clear. Play it on an island? Well, there's a lot of those on this map for starters. Am I supposed to go into an area on the islands or somewhere around them? The game never says. You can find an NPC that tells you it's at the fire monolith, but even if you can connect the dots and realize that this single flame indicates this is a fire monolith, the sun sigil isn't on an obvious tile, in fact sitting outside the building in a grassy corner. The one that I am so thankful I knew about going into this playthrough was the Watergate key. My first time playing this game was in the Dragon Quest 1+2 pack for the Game Boy that was released in 1999 in Japan and 2000 for America. This release was a port of the 1993 SNES remakes, and they included a ton of quality of life improvements and clarity changes to the quest lines. The Watergate key is a quest that is communicated to the player through the legend of its owner, Rogue Fastfingers, who has been arrested and is being held in the prison of Welgarth. But when you go there and ask the guard where Rogue is, he says he up and disappeared. The idea is that this is a locked room mystery, where you have to scour around for the sneaky thief. In the remakes of the game, there is visual indication that Rogue never left his room, and by poking around, you can find him in a little hole in the wall, where he gives you the key. But in the original NES release, there's zero indication of him being nearby, and unless you get the itch to just walk through a wall, you can easily miss his hiding spot and the key. The most infamous, though, is the Life Crest, which not only is the most disconnected crest from the rest of the group, but requires not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 items after you get the ship to acquire it, and even then, it's not on the beaten path. It is almost guaranteed to be the final crest you acquire, and since you find it in the penultimate dungeon of the entire game before the final area, you have to leave and come back to it in order to fully explore the dungeon. There is only one NPC in the entire game who tells you where the crest is, and even then, the Cave of Roan is a massive dungeon both in difficulty and size, so good luck finding the crest and making it out in one piece. I can see the idea behind making the crest hunt as open-ended and vague as it was, because of course having them sitting out on a shiny pedestal for us to take would be a little too video gamey and less adventurous. But I think the game went too far in the opposite direction and wasn't as clear as they could have been. The Water Crest is a great example, where there's only one NPC in the entire game who tells you about it, and he's in a location that is pretty difficult to get to that requires the Jailer's Key, and his hint is only that it is in the town of Hamlin. This hint, combined with the Echoing Flute, would make it fairly easy to find, because the crest is on a small screen in an underground area after you fight a couple of imps. But because this hint is placed so far out of the way of Hamlin, and requiring items that progress other quests, it's doubtful a player would ever hit the sequence of events that leads to them getting the Jailer's Key, and then coming here before poking around for the Water Crest. Overall, the exploration the game introduces is a massive expansion from the original game, with several good aspects, but a significant amount of obfuscation and a lack of clear design that makes the world a pain to navigate through without a guide of some sort. It feels like the game wasn't quite tested properly, especially past earning the ship, since NPCs that give relevant hints end up in very sporadic places with little rhyme or reason to them compared to the early game. But of course, exploration in RPGs isn't limited to an overworld. There are dungeons to talk about, and thankfully, I have much more positive things to say about these. The dungeons in the first Dragon Quest were extremely rudimentary. Not only was there a very limited number of them, but they were all fairly similar in their design. Dark areas with limited visibility that were labyrinthine in design. If you had a torch or used the Radiant spell, you could increase your visibility, but you were always slowly mapping places out as you walked through them. Aesthetically, they were also very bland, rarely differentiating themselves enough to stand apart from each other outside of their layouts. Dragon Quest II not only diversifies the environments of the dungeons to make them stand out visually, but changes how dungeon exploration is handled to make it far more intuitive and less awkward for first-time players. Instead of dungeons being dark and needing to illuminate them, everything is lit up properly, and the mystery of exploration is instead handled through obscuring rooms and hallways. The pathways are still numerous and feature several dead ends, some with treasure and some without, but the game is far better at designing environments that are both visually and mentally stimulating. In fact, if it weren't for this game sharing a flaw with the original title, I would say these would be a blanket step up in every regard. Unfortunately, the dungeons, outside of required items needed for progression, are often not very good at rewarding players for going out of their way to explore every corner. In the first Dragon Quest, chests would respawn after you opened a couple of them at a time, and it was possible to get the same item multiple times if you abused that knowledge correctly. This was how I showed off the infinite money glitch, for example. Dragon Quest II shares the same flaw, which was due to the password system in the Japanese version. With over 100 chests, if they individually tracked every single one being open or not, it would make the password system an impossible nightmare to deal with, so they settled for giving chests lackluster rewards outside of a select few instances. Of course, those select few instances end up breaking the game in some unintended ways, perhaps the most infamous being the evil clown that gives infinite money. Under Middenhall Castle, there's a prison area, and the most heavily guarded of its inmates is an enemy that, upon defeat, will drop the Staff of Thunder. Alone, this is a fantastic item, one that casts Infernos for no MP costs, which turns Moonbrook into a machine that pumps endless magic at enemies with no regard for human life. But if you save and reset out of the game, you'll find the clown back in the dungeon as if you never beat him. If you beat him without the staff in your inventory, i.e. selling it, you'll get another one. Selling the staff nets you a cool 19,500 gold, essentially meaning that for the rest of the game, money is a non-issue. Ordinarily, I would try to avoid using exploits like this, since it clearly wasn't intended and shatters the game's economy like a twig, but I already explained why this game is bullshit earlier, so I have no ill will evening the playing field a little bit. To circle back to the dungeon discussion, the issue with the chests in this game is that because of the respawning chests, the developers didn't want to give the players the possibility of replicating strong, game-changing items, which is a fair idea. However, when I go down a long corridor in a late-game dungeon, fight dozens of encounters that nearly kill me, and I'm at my wit's end, and all I get is a chain sickle, I can't help but sulk. The worst case scenario is when you find an empty chest, or god forbid a trapped one that damages you for daring to be curious. Mimics are no stranger to games like this, but when the risk-reward ratio is already so skewed in favor of risk, the booby traps feel like kicking while we're down. This, combined with the already discussed enemy design issues, make the dungeons, which are an improvement over the first game from a visual and design standpoint, feel worse than the original game, which is a damn shame. There's a lot of cool ideas here, like the inclusion of towers that you can hop out of to escape if you're on the edges of the map, which creates a sense of verticality the first game never had, as well as featuring much brighter backgrounds for the maps, which is a cool aesthetic. The sea cave has hot lava to walk over that damages you with each step, but if you manage to craft the water flying cloth, you can negate the heat of the flames. For one of your party members, but it makes party upkeep easier for the other two. And the Cave of Roan uses seemingly infinite hallways to create mind-twisting mazes that the first game couldn't hope to accomplish. By modern standards, these dungeons are fairly basic, but it's really cool seeing dungeons that no doubt inspired later RPGs, including some of my favorites in this title. But all the cool ideas in the world can't save the fact that this game is simply poorly tuned to create a smooth experience. The world and dungeons being bigger and more complex is great, if not for the fact that exploration is made far more difficult due to a variety of factors. Some I've discussed, and some I still haven't, like the limited inventory. While we have more space than the previous title, each character can only hold 8 items at a time, and that includes equipped weapons and armor, so it's closer to 4 to 5 spaces of inventory. Hell, I bought a shield that Moonbrook can't even equip just to give her the ability to self-heal free of MP charges in battle, so that took up a slot. The 4 keys all take up slots, so while they aren't consumable like last time, you're eating into a sixth of your inventory with those. I mentioned the Leaf of the World Tree earlier, which is a pretty vital item for negating bad luck in fights, and there's also the story-required items like the Moon Fragment, Eye of Malroth, and Charm of Rubus, all requiring inventory space. Remember the Cloak of Wind from the beginning of the game? It's needed once, and then never again, but the game never communicates that. And without a vault or storage system of any kind, if you play this game without a guide, you're likely to hold on to items far too long out of fear you need them again for any reason. It makes the game that much harder because you can't reliably stock up on items without risking being unable to carry required items you may stumble into. Even funnier is that the game does include monsters that drop items, but outside of the evil clown mentioned earlier, it is exceedingly rare for them to drop anything worth a shit. 9 times out of 10, it's extra gold or extremely weak armor pieces. It all goes back to the fact that this game just isn't as finely tuned as the first. Dragon Quest was a basic romp, sure, but it is perfectly manageable even today with little knowledge of it or the RPG genre as a whole. This game, despite having little narrative tissue with the first, requires you to have played the first game, or more likely in this day and age, have played another RPG at some point to better understand the realities you're facing here. Even then, having the ability to recognize poor design doesn't mean it becomes easier to manage. All of these issues raise one simple question. What happened here? Dragon Quest II releasing so soon after the first isn't quite as big of a shock when you consider how easy it was to develop games back in the 80s compared to today. Hell, all the way up until the mid-2000s. If developers wanted to, it was entirely possible to release entire trilogies in a console's life cycle with clever asset reuse and knowledge retention. But let's take a look at some of the examples from around this period to build some context. Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels released on June 3rd, 1986 in Japan, 8 months and 3 weeks after the release of the original Super Mario Bros. Zelda 2 released on January 14th, 1987, 10 months and 24 days after the original Legend. It was a terrible night to have a curse only 336 days after Simon vanquished Dracula the first time, and another RPG series Dragon Quest helped inspire, Final Fantasy, took 365 days to release its first of many numbered sequels. Dragon Quest II was greenlit before the first game's release, but it didn't begin earnest development until after its May 27, 1986 release date. When Enix asked Koichi Nakamura for an estimated release window for the sequel, he gave them December as the tentative window. Let's be generous and assume it would release on December 27, 1986. That gave the team at Chunsoft 214 days to create an entire RPG sequel. The Lost Levels took over a month longer than that to release and was a platformer, a genre that requires much less fine-tuning to make a satisfying gameplay experience, combined with the fact that a majority of that game's assets are reused compared to DQ, drastically overhauling its art style to make the game look significantly better, on top of increasing the map size by thousands of tiles and throwing in tons of complexity that was previously not there, like the added party members, spells, weapons, and armor, and the enemy formations being increased from 1 at a time to as many as 8. This meant a significant amount of work for the team, and while the programmers from the original team did return, they had to expand the total number of programmers from 3 to 7. Doubling your team size and having to get them acclimated into a work environment is already a daunting enough task, but doing so with a rapidly approaching deadline? I don't envy Nakamura's workload on this title. He's listed as the director and chief programmer on the title, having to implement every idea and debug as much as humanly possible in the limited time allowed to the team. Nakamura said the team never really established who was in charge of what, and when things started to go awry, such as bugs and balance issues, the inexperienced team began growing hostile towards each other. Nakamura described it as, quote, "None of us were true professionals then. We still had one foot in the student world, so everyone started blaming everyone else, and it created a hostile atmosphere in the development." This unstable atmosphere meant that Nakamura was managing personalities just as much as he was managing the title, and it resulted in him having less time to debug and balance than he did for the first game. While the game was technically finished by November of 1986, when Hori and Nakamura went to see how a playthrough of the game felt, the two were mortified. It was a game Hori described as something, quote, you could hardly play. Why? Let's go down the list. The combat was horrifically unbalanced. All the problems I listed in the actual release, believe it or not, they were not only worse in the pre-release build, but so much worse it was impossible to reach the Prince of Connacht. Monsters were too strong, appeared in too great of numbers, and the Prince of Middenholm not having access to magic meant taking out monsters one at a time no matter what. Connacht Castle was even farther away from Middenhall Castle, located where the Lake Cave is in the final build. You can actually see that old location on the back of the Dragon Quest II vinyl from back in the day, which is a neat detail and shows how rapidly the builds for the game were changing. One of the first things changed with the combat was limiting the amount of monsters that could be encountered on the first continent, a maximum of 3 at a time. It was an improvement, and certainly made the beginning of the game easier, but it wasn't enough. The game needed to be delayed a month to its eventual January 27th, 1987 release just to give the team enough time to playtest properly. Nakamura did attempt to create a simulator program that could balance each monster properly, and was able to do so in a one-on-one situation. The monsters were balanced as if it was still the first game, and not in a group-on-group scenario, making consecutive fights a near impossibility without risking life and limb. The team was doing its best to give feedback and test every area they could, adjusting item locations like putting the Mirror of Ra in the swamp area outside of Hamlin so the Princess of Moonbrook could journey with the party to the Tower of Wind, instead of it being the reward at the top of the tower, since the team found doing the entire tower without her was also extraordinarily difficult. The team was constantly giving notes back and forth, submitting new builds faster and faster, starting with 4 to 5 day increments, then speeding up to 2 to 3 day increments, and eventually daily, some even within the same day. Hori directly recalled labeling a build December 8th, 4 AM version. Spell power, spell progression, item and recovery costs at the inns and churches, all of these were constantly adjusted. The team was doing everything they could to alleviate the difficulty and make things manageable, but when all was said and done, they were still unable to walk away completely satisfied. The tight development is what's known in the game industry as crunch, and while it is frowned upon publicly, developers from all over the world have no doubt encountered it at one point in their careers. The reality of game development as a job is that it does feature a lot of scope bloat, where what was once thought simple and obtainable in a reasonable amount of time quickly spirals out of control due to unforeseen circumstances. This is the first instance of talking about it on this channel, but it certainly won't be the last. Dragon Quest II's crunch was a result of young developers thinking they were more capable than they were and biting off more than they could chew. Nakamura has been on the record several times after the fact, saying Dragon Quest II's development was so hectic and stressful that it was one of the worst experiences in his professional career. Quote, "It was such a disaster that I actually thought about quitting altogether." Hori was so exhausted by the end of it all that he collapsed with stomach ulcers, later describing it as, quote, "being inches away from having a permanent hole in his stomach." With how rushed development was, there was content that was planned and eventually cut, such as dedicated cutscenes. There are remnants of these in the manual as well as the NES version. The sacking of Moonbrook Castle in the opening wasn't in the original game, though it was intended, hence the manual featuring a scene from the original intended opening cutscene. There was a planned story sequence where the Prince of Connacht fell ill with a curse from Hargon, as well as more alternative story scenarios and armor sets that changed the party's appearance. Some of these did eventually find their way into the game, such as the Prince falling ill being included in the eventual DQ 1+2 remakes on SNES and all future ports, as well as a planned piece of armor for the Princess of Moonbrook that became a popular meme among the Japanese fanbase. As mentioned above, there was a plan to have armor visibly change the character's appearance in select instances. The biggest example being the now infamous, scandalous swimsuit that the Princess of Moonbrook can wear in later MSX ports of the game. This swimsuit is a comically expensive piece of equipment, but it does have stellar defense with a chance of stunning the enemies on screen every turn as long as it's equipped. A little silly to be sure, but its infamy lies in a small scene exclusive to the MSX version where the King of Tantagel reveals he has a magazine of the princess in the swimsuit and... Holy shit. I cannot believe this got released in a commercial video game at all, let alone from a series as prestigious as Dragon Quest. It's so hilariously bad that it still gets referenced in Japanese communities and media to this day, such as the game La Mulana, which celebrates the MSX and its history. It's a lot to process, isn't it? A game so stressful and agonizing to make that even in some later versions of the game, they can't quite escape that rushed and patchwork feeling that the original final product had. And to think that if the game released as originally finished in November of 1986, we wouldn't have a completed trilogy, let alone the juggernaut that is Dragon Quest's presence in Japan, or Square Enix as the publishing giant that they are today. I've said it before, but Dragon Quest II may be a frustrating and painful experience in its worst moments, but there's flashes of brilliance there, thanks to the undeniable passion and talent by a dev team trying desperately to wrestle free of their own hubris. With everything we need to go take on Hargon, including the charm of Rubis we earn for collecting the 5 crests and presenting them to her at her shrine, we can finally make our way through the final push towards him. The Cave of Roan and its many pitfalls and seemingly infinite hallways are absolutely unfair to the uninitiated and will result in several game overs if you happen into some of the more unfair enemy formations, or God forbid, the infamous Hork Pit on the very bottom floor of the place. But even if you manage to make it through here, you still have Roan itself to journey through before making it to Hargon's castle. This place is a one last kick in the nuts though, because not only is it the hardest area in the entire game, it's so unabashedly difficult that it makes the Dragon Lord's castle look tame in comparison. Enemies in this area can not only hit hard, sometimes multiple times a turn, rock powerful area of effect spells like Explodette that can two-shot the party at this point, and have seriously high HP pools, making them spongy as hell, but some are rocking the Defeat spell, which, if it isn't clear, acts like this.
Arrest them.
Son, you have a right to refuse his order, and I guarantee you're gonna die if you touch me, and there's no afterlife. Everything just goes black. Don't do it!
Whoa, Rick! Okay, what was that?
Death.
What kind?
Instant.
There was no sound, he just died.
Yeah, terrifying. It's a terrifying thing to watch happen. It's called a deterrent.
You couldn't just knock him out?
How is knocking out a deterrent? Everyone wants to be knocked out. Nobody wants to be dead.
Needless to say, you will need to grind here, and no small amount either. It took me 5 hours of grinding in this place just to get to a level capable of defeating the final boss. And even then, it wasn't a clean win. Those 5 hours were also sped up through the use of multiple in-game exploits, like item duplication allowing me to create a second water flying cloth for the Prince of Connacht, as well as a glitch where you can equip traditionally cursed items that damage the player on use for no drawback, and in fact give them secondary properties, like that of the Falcon Sword, while retaining their best-in-class damage. This is how I was able to do things like make Mindenhall attack twice in a turn for absurd damage, equalizing fights in my favor for the grind session. I didn't use this for the final dungeon, just to be clear, only to grind, but it still took me 5 hours to get to a level capable of beating the final boss. That is absolutely ridiculous, and I feel like I can't properly explain why with just words, so let's do some math again to explain how much grinding I had to do. When I got to Roan, my levels were 19, 17, and 14 for each party member respectively. That may sound wildly out of sync at first, but the game properly scales EXP for each party member, and their maximum levels are all different. with Mittenhall, Canuck, and Moonbrook having maximum levels of 50, 45, and 35 respectively, with comparable stats at those levels. The levels they were at when I first reached Rhone were a minimum of 30 to 32,000 experience. That's a lot of experience. The levels I was at when I beat the game? 30, 28, and 22, which required 230,000 experience to reach. That is an astronomical jump of 766% of the current experience we had at the start of the grinding session. And while the enemies in this area do grant an average of over 1,000 experience per battle, the insane damage they can do in just a single turn means that sometimes you'll spend a minute in the fight thinking you've got things in the bag and then bam, party wipe. Perhaps the only saving grace here is the Monolith of Rhone, which not only acts as the final save point, but fully heals and revives the party from any and all statuses free of charge. It's a godsend, and I'm not afraid to say that without this here, the endgame would go from an annoying slog to a controller cracking exercise in frustrating design in video games. But after all of this is said and done, I got my party to levels I felt were comfortable to tackle the endgame, and we made our way to the castle of Hargon. Entering the castle, we're greeted with Castle Mittenhall? Strange, but everything seems to be as it was at the start of the game, down to the chests. The only difference is the king is on the bottom floor, telling us to go and that his fate is in our hands. Something's not right. Holding the Charm of Rubus aloft reveals that this castle is an illusion, one devised by Hargon to throw us off and potentially trap us here forever if we weren't careful. After finding the pathways to the upper parts of the castle comes the true final push towards the evil wizard, which includes several forced boss fights against recolored enemies such as Atlas, Bazuzu, and Zarlox. These fights can be extremely difficult, especially Atlas with how hard he hits, but I got lucky and managed to land a critical hit on turn 1, which resulted in a 2-turn victory. My levels were high enough that I was able to put down the next 2 bosses as well with minimal issue, though I did have to use a bunch of healing magic to keep Mittenhall up because no matter how strong you get in this game, your durability never really improves. But finally, after all of the struggles to get here, all the stress and party wipes and grinding, we've made it to Hargon. He's a little less willing to negotiate than the Dragon Lord was with our ancestor, instead chastising us for our audacity and beginning the final fight. He's, kind of a joke. We beat him in 3 turns after disabling his magic with the stop spell, so all's well that ends well, right? Not quite. With his defeat, Hargon tells us of a foe even greater than him in strength, one even more wicked that he's going to summon to defeat us. Malroth. Stepping back, flames surround us, and we're greeted with the true final boss of Dragon Quest II. Malroth is a monster if you don't play your cards right. He doesn't have a ton of attacks, but what he does have is designed specifically to hit hard and sustain himself as long as possible. His Fire Breath hits the full party for spread damage, and if you don't have the Water Flying Cloth to reduce the damage of fire attacks, it will thoroughly roast you. The worst part of this fight, though, isn't his offense, it's his infinite MP, which he will use to cast Heal All on himself, which entirely heals him and resets any damage you've done over the course of the fight. That's why the absolute best thing you can do to save yourself grief is to use 2 magic spells that up until this point have had minimal use: Increase and Defense. The names aren't super clear, but they are a massive boon for this fight. Increase makes your entire party's defense better, which means more time attacking and less healing. But defense is the big one. If you land this, it lowers the defense of the target, and since Malroth has no way of resetting his lowered stats, it means he'll take that increased attack through the rest of the fight. At the start of the fight, Middenhall was doing 25-ish damage with his attacks, and by the end, I was doing almost double that. It makes a significant difference, and while Moonbrook did die in the process, I finally managed to put this bastard down, beating Dragon Quest II. The game's ending is similar to the first, where upon evil's defeat, all the monsters of the world retreat and the townspeople celebrate our accomplishments. This game has more unique NPC dialogue to interact with if you so choose, like the missing king of Tantagel, who was hiding in the attics of one of the buildings of Tantagel and will apologize for his cowardly behavior if you found him earlier in the game. The Dragon Lord's grandson will offer the Hand of Friendship to the heroes instead of following up on his earlier threats. The spirits in Moonbrook Castle will thank us for restoring Rubus's light to the world, and the Prince of Connacht's family will congratulate him and us on a job well done. Finally, in Middenhall, the king offers his son the chance to rule Middenhall as he has proven himself a worthy defender of the realm along with his cousins. Accepting the crown, the former king makes one last decree, that the 3 Luminaries be celebrated and their defense against evil be everlasting. The final line of the game being a simple, "Then peace returned." Well, that was certainly a ride. Dragon Quest II is perhaps one of the best examples of how just simple tweaks to a game can really make or break it. This is a game that was rushed so badly that its creators call it some of the most stressful work they've ever been a part of, and that they were both disappointed in the final product, and you can really see why as you play. It starts off so promising, with the opening before you get the boat being difficult but not impossibly so. You can't quite tell that the game's balance is out of whack because your own party starts off so weak that surely it's just a matter of time until your power level gets better. But that time never comes, and as the game goes on, it just becomes a muddy, monotonous mess of unclear direction and unfair combat that makes no amount of grinding feel satisfying. RPGs are supposed to be the pull yourself up by your bootstraps genre, the promise that as long as you try and put in the effort, statistically, you will get better, but because of how improperly scaled everything is, and how you can just get flat out unlucky if you don't take advantage of exploits and guides, this game will aggravate you even more than it did me. I played this game with the intent of not using a guide since I had played and beat several versions of it already, having a general idea of where to go and what to do, but when I realized just how difficult it was to make money in this version of the game, and how one bad fight would half that gain, I knew I needed to save my sanity. I've seen several people say this game is beatable without a guide, and while that is true, it's not recommended whatsoever. Even a basic knowledge of where items are located does so much to cut down on unnecessary backtracking and dealing with the absurd encounter rates for another several hours, and knowing how to use the equipable item glitch at the end of the game, whether you use it for just grinding like I did, or even to beat the final bosses, makes such a huge difference. I recommend the You Can Beat Video Games 2-part guide on the game, which has a solid pace and explains the game in depth if you're curious about the how and why of everything he does. The links will be down in the description. Dragon Quest II may not be the most enjoyable experience in the modern day with the experience that I have now, and I would not personally recommend this version of it to anyone who wasn't deathly curious about it. If you have to play Dragon Quest II nowadays, I would recommend literally anything made after the 1993 DQ1+2 remake on SNES. That version is the basis for all modern versions of the game, with updated progression, character and monster balancing, item pool updates, and so much more. You can buy the GBC port, you can buy it on Nintendo Switch, you can even get it on your mobile phone. The game is accessible and has been updated to be a smoother experience, though the exploits from the original version no longer exist, so you can't generate infinite money on a whim, unfortunately. There's no bad way to play it, and while people, including myself, may not love the modern version's smoothed over sprites, it's a cheap way to play the game that supports the devs and shows Square Enix interest in the series, so it's still worthwhile in that way. Dragon Quest II's development was hell for its creators. So much so that the team took time to decompress from it all after the fact and allow themselves time to recuperate. By the time the game launched in late January, the team was expecting similar numbers to the original Dragon Quest. Solid, but not a phenomenon. They would be surprised to see it outsell the original by much if at all. To their shock, not only did Dragon Quest II score high marks from many Japanese publications, including a near-perfect score from Famitsu with a 38 out of 40 score, but the game sold 500,000 copies on its first day available in Japan, something the first game never managed to do in a single day. The developers might have been disappointed with the final product, but fans and critics saw a game that pushed the series forward in so many positive directions, from using Akira Toriyama's unique style and monster designs to greater effect, giving Koichi Sugiyama more space to stretch his wings and compose some great tunes, and giving us a true world to explore from top to bottom, even if the process of said exploration was a bit of a mess. The ending of the game being so difficult was seen as aspirational, something to strive towards and eventually overcome, similar to how a Souls-like game would be tackled nowadays. Koichi Nakamura's story is one that I don't feel quite enough people know about when it comes to the history of RPGs and gaming as a whole. We as gamers typically look at the creative minds, larger-than-life personalities, and the weirdos when it comes to celebrities in the gaming space, and all of those people are important, no doubt. But here was a man, a 22-year-old, who was not only managing his own company, not only managing a team, but doing so under some of the most intense and chaotic pressure ever seen in gaming's history. Managing a game that, for all intents and purposes, didn't need to be made. Dragon Quest had already been released, and a success. One-hit wonders are not uncommon, and in fact, more common than many would like to admit. Lightning doesn't always strike twice, but Nakamura was able to buckle down, hold the line, and get the game across the finish line in a state that, while he may not be entirely proud of it today, can say that it was a good teaching tool for him and, most importantly, a defining memory of his career. Dragon Quest II not only established the series as here to stay, but it gave Chunsoft and Nakamura the energy and credentials to push even higher in the future. Quote, "When I was asked what the best experience I've had in my time at Chunsoft was, I can also point to the release day of Dragon Quest II, when we saw people standing in those amazingly long lines to purchase the game." It's pretty wild to think that I'm only 4 years older than Koichi Nakamura was when he created this game, and have accomplished not as much. But that's the fun of retrospectives like this, getting to look back, dig deep, and really appreciate the details of what went into projects like this. Dragon Quest II, despite all of its flaws, wears its heart on its sleeve, and it's that passion and energy that pushed it into the forefronts of so many gamers' minds back in the day. Thankfully, the next game we'll be looking at is one I won't have nearly as much negative to say, both about its development or the final product. Join me next time as we take a look at the culmination of the trilogy and one of the most iconic video games ever made, Dragon Quest III. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is Seth. I appreciate each and every one of you, and take care.